The ballroom shimmered with candlelight and champagne. Everything had been planned down to the last napkin fold, Cassidy's signature touch. Gold-accented menus, personalized table assignments, a jazz quartet playing softly in the corner. Darren looked sharp in his tailored tuxedo, his arm around his new wife, both of them glowing with newlywed warmth. I sat at a round table near the back next to the ice sculpture. My name was spelled wrong on the place card, but I didn't mention it. Cassidy's mother, Pamela, had already given a speech earlier in the evening, tearful and eloquent, speaking of watching her daughter grow into a strong woman. The room had applauded politely, some even wiping away tears. I didn't speak. No one had asked me to. The clinking of a spoon against a glass silenced the room. Darren stood microphone in hand, his arms still draped around Cassidy's waist. He cleared his throat, smiling at the guests. I just want to take a moment. He began, his voice steady, to thank someone really special. Someone who's been like a rock through all of this. My real mother. He turned and looked across the room, not at me, but past me toward Pamela. Pamela, thank you for welcoming me into your family, for being such a loving and steady presence. I'm so lucky to have you. Applause broke out immediately. Chairs shifted. People turned to look first at Pamela, then at me. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded in my lap, the cloth napkin still draped untouched. I kept my smile small and composed. I've had years of practice hiding things behind that smile. Pamela placed her hand over her heart with a gracious nod, dabbing beneath her eye as if this was all too much. Cassidy leaned in and kissed Darren's cheek. Someone at the next table murmured, "That was beautiful." I felt none of it. Just a sudden emptiness in the middle of my chest, like a thread pulled too tight, had finally snapped. I stared at the candle in front of me, the flame flickering ever so slightly, and thought, so this is how it feels to disappear. Later, when they danced their first dance and everyone gathered around them, I stayed seated. I watched as my son twirled his bride, his face alight with joy. And I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. This wasn't a one-time slip. This was who he'd become. And the worst part was I had let him. The year was 1978 when my world split open. It was a rainy afternoon in March when the phone rang. I still remember the tremble in the dispatcher's voice as she said the words I never thought I'd hear. There's been an accident. Your sister and her husband, they didn't make it. The world tilted. I couldn't breathe. I drove straight to the hospital, still in my scrubs, soaked through with rain by the time I arrived. Darren was there, tiny, confused, sitting on a gurney with his knees pulled to his chest. 5 years old. His cheeks were streaked with tears and soot. He kept whispering the same word, "Mommy, Mommy," over and over, like it was a prayer that might undo everything. They asked me if I was willing to take him in temporarily. I said yes before they finished the sentence. It wasn't temporary. I knew it even then. I was 22, a nurse's aide with barely enough money to cover rent. But that night, I held him while he sobbed into my shoulder, and something inside me anchored around him. I became his home, whether either of us knew how to say it. Raising Darren was never easy. I worked double shifts at St. Joseph's, then took side work at a retirement home on weekends. I gave up dating entirely. No man wanted to deal with a woman who smelled like antiseptic and came with a grieving child. I let my hair go gray early, never found the time or money for beauty salons, vacations, or even a real day off. But I tried. God, I tried. For every toy I couldn't afford, I made something. Cardboard castles. Painted shoebox dioramas. I once spent 3 nights sewing a makeshift Batman cape from old scrubs for his 6th birthday. I couldn't give him much, but I gave him memories. He never called me Mom. He called me Aunt Irene. I told myself it was okay. He was grieving. I didn't want to force the role onto him. But when he turned 18, I sat him down and told him the truth that he wasn't mine by blood, that I'd adopted him after the crash. He barely looked up from his cereal. I figured, he said. You're not really my mom. I nodded, slowly, hiding the way my hands trembled under the table. I just thought you deserved to know officially. He shrugged. Thanks, I guess. Then he got up and left his bowl in the sink. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just his age, the mood, the awkwardness. But that sentence wedged itself inside me like a stone. Not really my mom. I had held him through night terrors, saved every report card, tended every fever, but I wasn't really anything. Still, I stayed. I kept giving. I watched him grow into a young man, handsome and quick-witted, a boy who once curled into my lap, now taller than me by inches. I never stopped being his mother, even when he began to drift, even when someone else started stepping into the space I used to hold. Cassidy came into Darren's life like a gust of cold air, smooth, sharp, and calculated. She was everything he had never dated before. Polished, driven, impeccably dressed even at casual gatherings. She smiled a lot, but her eyes always looked past me. The first time I met her, Darren brought her over for a quick dinner. I made his favorite chicken pot pie from scratch the way I always had since he was a boy. She barely touched her plate, said she was gluten-free, then spent the rest of the meal talking about her company's latest pitch to a luxury real estate developer. Darren just listened and nodded, eating like he hadn't had a home-cooked meal in months. Maybe he hadn't. When they left that night, she offered a stiff hug that barely brushed my shoulder. Thanks so much, Irene. She said, her voice crisp and distant. Not thank you, Mrs. Sandoval. Not even this was lovely. Just a thank you the way you offer it to a stranger handing you a receipt. Still, I told myself she'd warm up, that she was just adjusting. But she never did. The longer they were together, the less I heard from Darren. The weekly phone calls became bi-weekly, then once a month. Then only when he needed something: his birth certificate, a recipe tax paperwork. His texts were brief, typed like obligations. He no longer asked how I was. I'd hear about Cassidy's mother, Pamela, in passing. She hosted engagement brunches, helped them plan trips, picked out furniture for their condo. I was never invited to those events, not even once. When the engagement was announced, it wasn't from Darren, it was a Facebook post. Cassidy tagged me in after it had already gone up. I commented with a heart. No one replied. A week later, I ran into an old neighbor at the grocery store. She congratulated me on Darren's wedding and asked if I'd been to the bridal shower. I laughed softly, pretending I had just missed it. Truth was, I hadn't been told it happened. It was subtle the way Cassidy's family edged me out. A missed invitation, a group photo I wasn't part of, a menu email that never included me, and Darren. He let it happen. No, he didn't just let it. He adjusted to it. One day, I found myself sitting at the edge of my bed, holding one of Darren's childhood drawings in my lap. It was a picture of us, him holding my hand under a sun, with a crooked smile. He'd signed it, me and Mom. That had been the year he stopped calling me Aunt Irene. I had spent so many years afraid I wasn't enough for him. Now I realized I had become invisible altogether. But when he came to my door asking for money, it wasn't just me he was asking. It was everything I had left. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Darren showed up unannounced. I was in the middle of folding laundry, the hum of the dryer filling the quiet. I opened the door with a cautious smile, surprised but hopeful. It had been weeks since I'd seen him. He didn't hug me, just stepped inside, glanced around like he hadn't been there 1,000 times before, and sat down on the couch I'd bought when he was still in high school. He didn't waste time. Cassidy and I have been looking at wedding venues. He began eyes scanning the room, but never landing on mine. We found a place we love, but it's a little out of budget. I didn't say anything, just nodded for him to go on. My heart was already tightening. Pamela's already contributed, he continued. But we need more. The venue we want. It's special. Has this rooftop view of the city really modern? It's perfect for the photos. Then came the pause, the softening of his voice. We need about 12,500. I blinked. Dollars. He nodded like he was asking for a cup of sugar. That's a lot of money, Darren. It's your son's wedding, he said, a hint of impatience slipping through. I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. You always said you wanted me to have a beautiful wedding. I sat down across from him. That's my emergency fund. The money I've saved for medical bills, or I hesitated for my funeral when the time comes. He leaned back, crossing his arms. If you really love me, you won't make this about money. I looked at him. My son. The boy I'd rocked through fevers. The teenager I stayed up waiting for during school dances. The man I now barely recognized. I swallowed hard and nodded. Give me a day, I said. I'll go to the bank. He stood up without smiling. Thanks, Mom. Cassidy will be relieved. We already reserved the date. He didn't ask how I'd get the money. Didn't ask if I'd be okay afterward. He left with a quick, distracted talk soon. At the bank the next morning, I withdrew every dollar from my savings account. The teller looked at me strangely. I signed the paperwork with steady hands, but something inside me was trembling. Back home, I wrote the check, sealed it in an envelope, and waited for Darren to come by. He didn't. Cassidy picked it up from my porch without knocking. There was no thank you call, no text, no acknowledgement. Weeks passed. I was barely mentioned in planning calls. Cassidy sent one email asking if I could wear something neutral so I wouldn't clash with the decor. I replied with, of course. No reply. The wedding was moving forward, and I apparently was expected to remain in the background. Still, I showed up early. I wore coral not too bright, not too pale. I smiled when they took pictures without me, and when Darren stood up to make his speech, I folded my hands in my lap and listened. The dress was the only thing I bought just for me. Coral. Soft, but not faded, not beige, not apologetic. It was the one color I always loved, but rarely dared to wear. Too bright, too loud, too noticeable. But this time I didn't ask permission. The saleswoman said it brought warmth to my skin. I believed her. I had it altered, just slightly paid extra for proper lining. I curled my hair that morning, used the perfume I usually saved for church. I even brought out the pearl earrings Darren gave me when he graduated college, back when I still felt like someone worth celebrating. When I arrived at the venue, no one greeted me. The planner barely looked at the list before pointing me to my table, table 17. In the back corner, near the server's entrance. I sat alone. Photos were being taken in the garden. I saw Pamela standing with Cassidy and Darren in front of the floral arch. Her hand rested proudly on Darren's shoulder. I waited for someone to wave me over. No one did. Later, as guests trickled in, Cassidy walked past my table. She gave me a quick glance and a tight smile. A bit bold, don't you think, she said, nodding at my dress. I opened my mouth to answer, but she was already walking away. I folded the linen napkin in my lap, smoothed the fabric of my skirt, and reminded myself to smile. That was the only way I knew how to survive moments like these, by pretending they were smaller than they felt. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The vows, the music, the lighting, everything choreographed like a magazine spread. Darren looked handsome. Grown. Not mine. At the reception, I stayed at my assigned seat, while the rest of the family posed for photos and clinked champagne. Pamela floated from table to table, glowing in a floor-length navy gown. Cassidy looked radiant. Darren smiled at everyone, but never once looked my way. Then came the toasts. Pamela spoke first. She praised her daughter's kindness, her grace, her ambition. She thanked Darren for joining their family. The applause was warm. Then Darren stood. He held the microphone like it was something sacred. He smiled at the room and said, "I want to thank someone who has meant the world to me. Someone who's been like a rock throughout this entire process. My real mother." He turned toward Pamela. "Thank you for welcoming me into your family. I love you." The applause was louder this time. Guests turned toward me, then quickly away. A few looked confused. Others just nodded along, clapping politely. I stayed seated, hands folded, dress glowing like an open wound. I smiled. That's what I remember most. I smiled like it meant nothing. But inside me, something split, quietly, permanently, and as I watched the people I had paid to celebrate, I knew something had to change. I got home from the wedding a little after midnight. I didn't turn on the TV or take off my shoes. I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the coral dress bunched around my knees like a question I no longer wanted to answer. The apartment was still, every shadow too familiar. My eyes wandered to the bookshelf lined with photo albums no one ever asked to see, and then to the hallway closet where I kept the box. It had been years since I opened it, maybe a decade, but I knew exactly where the key was. Taped to the underside of my dresser drawer was a small envelope labeled "Emergencies Only." Inside, the key fit perfectly into the old metal lock. I pulled the box out from under my winter coats and carried it to the table. Inside were records, investments, savings deeds, documents, stacks of old bank statements with my notes scribbled in the margins, certificates of deposit I'd rolled over quietly for years. The land near Oak Hill my father bought in the 60s was now worth 10 times what he'd paid. My father always believed in preparing for the worst but never showing it. The loudest wealth is often the weakest, he told me once. Stay quiet. Stay ready. I totaled everything. My breath caught. I wasn't rich, not by Cassidy's standard, but I was far from the helpless old woman they assumed I was. There was over $300,000 sitting in that box, and more if the market held. The next morning, I called Mr. Harland, the same lawyer who handled my father's estate. I scheduled an appointment and walked into his office with a folder of documents and a clear plan. "I want to change my will," I said. He looked up. "You'd like to add someone?" "No. I'd like to remove someone." And just like that, I removed Darren from everything, every account, every deed, every dollar. Instead, I created a foundation, small but meaningful, for women like me. Single adoptive mothers who raised children with no help, no applause, and no thanks. Mr. Harland didn't ask questions. He just nodded and made it legal. As I left his office, the sun hit my face in a way that made me stop on the sidewalk. For a brief second, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt seen, but not by anyone else. Just by me. And that was the first time in years I realized how much I had left to claim. The penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows and silence that felt earned. I moved in 2 weeks after finalizing the foundation paperwork. No announcement. No forwarded address. Just a quiet shift boxes carried by strangers into a space that felt nothing like the life I'd lived before. And that was the point. 3 days after I moved, Darren and Cassidy showed up uninvited. The concierge called up hesitant. "There's a couple here asking for you." "A Mr. and Mrs. Sandoval." I let them up. When the elevator doors opened and they stepped inside, their faces froze. Cassidy blinked at the marble floors. Darren looked at the art I'd hung prints I'd bought for myself, not because anyone else would see them. "Mom, what is this place?" "My home," I said simply. They walked through slowly, like tourists in a museum. Cassidy ran her fingers along the edge of the dining table. Darren kept glancing between the view and me. "I don't understand," he finally said. "How could you afford this?" I walked to the sideboard, poured myself tea, and took a quiet sip before answering. "My father taught me to invest." I listened. Darren stared at me like he was trying to do math that wouldn't add up. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I met his eyes. "You never asked." Cassidy opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. It doesn't matter now. I'm no longer interested in explaining myself to people who only hear me when there's money involved. They stood there stunned. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was clarity. Darren looked like he might say something else, but I turned away, walked to the window, and let the city speak for me. And later that night, the apology finally came, but not in the way I expected. The first bouquet arrived the next morning. White roses, a card signed only with his name. Then came the texts. Cassidy, then Darren, then Cassidy, again. At first polite, then pleading, then quiet. Pamela called and asked to clear the air. I told her I didn't take meetings with people who only learned my name after a checkbook disappeared. 3 days passed. Then Darren called and asked what I wanted. I want a public apology, I said, on camera, posted where everyone can see it. He was quiet for so long, I thought the line had gone dead. That's humiliating, he finally muttered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Later that week, the video appeared online. He was seated in what looked like his office. Pale hands folded awkwardly in front of him. No script, no background music, just Darren facing the camera with tired eyes. He talked about me, about everything I did for him, about how he'd taken it all for granted. He admitted I raised him when no one else would, that he'd ignored me, embarrassed me, erased me. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, only that I deserved to be seen. The comments filled up fast. Most of them angry, disappointed in him, some defending me, others simply stunned. That night I watched the video once alone with the lights off. Then I closed the laptop, turned off my phone, and sat in the silence. It wasn't hate I felt. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was space. A quiet, necessary space between who I'd been and who I refused to be anymore. And the next morning, I started packing for Seattle. The boxes were stacked neatly by the door, labeled in my handwriting. Seattle wasn't a fresh start, it was a return. Old friends, cooler air. A place where no one would look at me and see only a title I never got to wear properly. Mother of the Groom. The letter came the day before I left. Handwritten envelope addressed in Darren's slanted print. Inside, pages full of sorrow and memory. He wrote about childhood moments I hadn't realized he still remembered. He said he'd failed me, that he saw it now, that he was sorry. I read it once, carefully. Then I opened the drawer in my bedroom, the one I'd left nearly empty for years. Inside was a photo Darren at 5 arms wrapped around my neck, a gap-toothed grin lighting up his whole face. I slipped the letter beside it. Not to treasure, not to forget, just to place it where it belonged, part of my life, but no longer at the center. I didn't hate him. I didn't even want him to suffer. I simply wanted to live a life that wasn't built around waiting for him to notice I'd always been there. And finally, I was ready.